So, to continue the discussion about Bruria, we saw the Gemara, we saw the Rashi. There's actually one little piece of the Gemara there that I realized afterwards I skipped through as we were going through the story. And there is some suggestion perhaps that there were actually two stories going on over there. Let's see whether we get to it. Let's just recount very quickly. Bruria's sister was taken by the Romans and put in a house of ill repute. Yes, and she was put in a brothel. And Rabbi Meir tested her moral probity. He tested her to see whether she had remained true and faithful. And she did. She withstood the test. And therefore he went above and beyond to save her, right? Which involved bribery. It involved a certain amount of... I have no other way probably of describing it other than a form of Kabbalah Ma'asis, which itself raises an interesting question. Practical Kabbalah, which is something that at many levels we don't get involved with at all, right? It's considered to be Osa. Even those who learn and study Kabbalah. So, for example, I'll give you one example. One of the classic introductory svarim for Kabbalah is the Shari Oira. And there he says in the Hakdama that it is one thing to the Sefer Shari Oira is an understanding of Hashem's names as they relate to the Esser Spheres. There are 10 main names of Hashem, and as they relate to the Esser Spheres, and that's important. But he writes with very strongly that, of course, Kabbalah Ma'asis, using, even if one were to be able to attain the knowledge and the capacity to use the secrets of Kabbalah to transcend the limitations of physical laws, but chas v'shalom, one would never do that. Unless you say Hatzalas Nefashos maybe is different. But Rabbi Meir clearly did do that with this magic earth that becomes, Elokah D'Meir Aneni, and it. So he used it. If he used it, first of all, it gives us an indication of his stature. This is Rabbi Meir. This is the Tana Rabbi Meir who was able to do that. So that's the first part of the story. And then he becomes a very wanted man, right? They put up his poster. His face was all over Rome, and posters all over, billboards all over Rome. So what does he do? And here I realized that I skipped over the story. I just read it through very quickly, and it may be important. So let me go over it very quickly. As a result of which he had to, if he would be recognized, his life would be in danger. The Gemara then says 2 or possibly 3 things which happened to him, and he managed to get out of danger by doing one of the following 3 things. Either he went into a house where there was bishul akum, proper bishul akum, and he dipped one finger into, he made as if he was eating bishul akum, right? To demonstrate, I'm not Rabbi Meir, I must be somebody else. Right? Because Rabbi Meir would never do that. What he did was, says the Gemara, he dipped one finger in and actually licked the other one. Right? The old party trick. Okay. So that's one thing. The other one was that he made as if he was going to be with a Zona. He didn't, but there was potentially a Maris Ayin element, which we may come back to later. And the other one that Eliyahu Hanavi. But either way, this is the other part of the story. Just remember that, because at some point it may become relevant. Something else I want to add when we talk about.
What is the connection to Eliyahu Hanavi?
Bring me the Gemara again. I seem to remember the Gemara says that. Yeah, Avodah Zarah, that's right. Thank you. That Eliyahu Hanavi. This was the top of Yud Ches Amud base. He went into the Beis Ikada Omri, Bishulei Akum Chaza Mamash Baha Chaza mamash baha u'mosak baha. Ikad amra osa Eliyahu arami osa Eliyahu idmalei kazoina. Eliyahu Hanavi came and appeared like a zoina. Berachte amre chas v'shalom irab meya hava lo hava ovid hachi. So, in other words, he acted in a way which would demonstrate this. Rabbi Meir, if this was Rabbi Meir, there's no way he ever would have behaved like this. And as we will see, possibly, there are some Rishonim who learn that, and then the next words are, Kom Orak, then he got up and he ran away, he fled, and he went to Bovel. And the Gemara ends off by saying, Ikada Amra Mehai Maisa, some say because of this Maisa, Ikada Amra Maisa de Bruria, and some say because of the story of Bruria, and then comes in the Rashi. Okay? So, there's a question of interpretation in the Gemara. Just give me a second. The question of interpretation in the Gemara is, and there would be one way of understanding the first bit, this Maisa, meaning either because he was in danger, his life was in danger, he couldn't stay there, or another way might be, and one of the Rishonim does mention this, that because he had acted in such a way that was certainly at a Maris Ayin level, he had acted in a way that was not fitting for Rabbi Meir to act, and therefore he had to go. That's one interesting Chilul Hashem aspect, even though he was entitled to do so because his life was in danger. Okay? The Ikad Omra, Maisa de Bruria, and then the silence on that, besides for Rashi, which we'll come to later. Yes?
I wonder if that would indicate that in those times, because he was trying to do this expression for his persecutors. Right?
Yes.
So it indicates to me that back then the Romans actually were thinking tzaddikim are really tzaddikim.
Yeah, well, newsflash, tzaddikim are tzaddikim. And
even the Romans would acknowledge.
Yes, no, I like your point.
Right.
Fair point. This is an expression of real integrity. And so much so that people said, oh no, that can't be, it must be his doppelganger. Another word which is used in English. Here, I presume you use it in German, right? Yeah. The German gave us this is his doppelganger. So it must be somebody else.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. When Gentiles
are shocked
then that says something.
Right.
That says something, because this is Rabbi Meir. Another story I want to mention, by the way, about Bruria, which we didn't mention. And it's interesting here. I've seen in some when one researches things like this, you get access today to multiple sources, and it's sometimes hard, from my perspective, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to know what would be considered to have credibility from an orthodox perspective. So, as an example of this, there is a medrash. The medrash is brought in two places. It's in somewhere in Vayikra Rabbah, but it's also in Yalkut on Eshes Chayil, where the medrash says the following story: that the wife of Rabbi Meir, and it's interesting, she's not mentioned by name. And I saw in one feminist journal, Jewish feminist journal, they make a whole song and dance about it. That she becomes, when in this context, she becomes voiceless, and it's fascinating. I mean, it may be a reasonable ha'ara to say why Chazal, she's well known. She is identified in the Yerushalmi, in the Tosefta, in the Gemara, in a few places by name. And here, all of a sudden, in the Medrash, she is not identified by name. But it's interesting to note, and it's a ha'ara, I don't know. But either way, what I'm much more interested about is the story. Maybe I should have printed it out and brought it, but I'll just say it. Again, it's to build up a picture of who Bruria was, that Rabbi Meir, they had two sons. And the indication is, I think, I don't know, I haven't done enough research, these were the children that they have. They didn't have any others. And on one Shabbos, they both died.
Sure.
They're both, yeah. And she, says the Medrash, and she, being cognizant of Shabbos and Hilchas Shabbos, covered them up and said nothing and went ahead. Imagine a mother who has two children, Le'aleinu v'le'alechem, And she goes through the rest of Shabbos. She doesn't tell her husband how he didn't realize they weren't at the table or whatever. I don't know. But she hides this, conceals this from him, this terrible personal tragedy. She conceals it from him all of Shabbos. And Motzei Shabbos, she engages him very cleverly in a conversation about if you get as a metaphor, as a parable, if you get you know the story, if you get a picodon, a picodon, a deposit, that's the difference.
Right.
You're given something and you have a stewardship role, a custodian role, a trustee role over something precious. And when the time comes to give it back, you can't have any tiners, can you? Because then it's taken back and it's given back. And this was her way of breaking the news to her husband, the terrible personal tragedy. And you see this is quoted in the Medrash, both in the Yalkut and in Vayikra Rabbah, primary sources, as Eshes Chayil, a tzaddikas, somebody who is able to shield her husband from this, to put the sanctity and the holiness of Shabbos as being paramount over her own. This is a woman who is displaying incredible personal strength and moral fiber at any level. So it's not just as a scholar, not just as somebody who is very wise, but we're seeing in this one, we're seeing incredible compassion. We're seeing depth and strength, Yiras Shamayim and Midas. It's incredible. And then we have to equate this with someone who then goes and has an affair, is seduced by one of Reb Meir's Talmidim. We have to do these two things. To what extent do these two things go together? Do they go together? So that's a question. You hear it makes the question a bit stronger. What else did I want to tell you on that? I think that was that. Now, where do we go from here? So I came across an article by there's a story even just behind the author of the article. His name was Rabbi Eitam Henkin, Hashem Yinkom Damai. He and his wife and children were brutally murdered by Arab terrorists on Sukkot. I think it was 2015. He was a Talmud Chacham. He was the son of a well-known Rosh Hashiva, Posek, Rav Henkin, his Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin, and he was a Talmud Chacham and a scholar in his own right, clearly a genius. And he wrote a fascinating ma'amar, which actually I'm thinking about it. I wonder whether I should even have photocopied, but it'll take too long because it's I think it's too good not to share. It's called, it was printed in a couple of journals. You can get it online if you know where to get hold of it. Talumat Masa de Bruria. And he dissects this Rashi in Avodah Zarah. The only source that we have, remember I mentioned to you, the only source we have about what is the pshat in this Gemara, Ikada Omri, Maisa de Bruria, what is the Maisa de Bruria? We have one source, and that is this Rashi. There is no other primary source. Okay? Why is that significant? So, he then does a number of very, very interesting things. And he compares this to a couple of other things. And I want to go through the highlights of it because it's really, really interesting. Okay. First of all, we saw, if you remember, I showed you Rabbeinu Nissim-Gon, Rabbeinu Hananel, I think it was, or Rabbeinu Nissim-Gon, who clearly has another whole, who was the Dor before Rashi, who says that Rabbi Meir got up and went with his wife, with Bruria, to Bavel. So he clearly, there's at least another opinion that sees the Maisa Bruria as very, very different. Now, he then begins to dissect this a little bit, dissect the story. And he says, you're talking about Pam Achas. I think I made this comment to you already yesterday. Once it said in the Rashi, according to the Rashi, once she expressed some skepticism about this, the Mama Chazal that Noshim Dat and Kalis. And you have to ask yourself, would Rabbi Meir have gone to such lengths? And that's before we even get, we mentioned it very briefly, the halachic permissibility of what he did, to demonstrate to his wife that Chazal are right, because she wants ligleg. First of all, it's interesting to say that she would be ligleg on Chazal, and that Chazal would have taken seriously, like we saw from the Tosefta and other places, and Rabbi Meir would have taken her view. From everything else we know about her, does it even seem reasonable that she was somebody who would be ligleg on Chazal? Okay, but then Pamachas, it says Pamachas. She expressed skepticism about a Mama Chazal. So what does he do? So Rabbi Meir goes and he tziva, that's the lashon we have in Rashi, commanded. Command? I mean, he doesn't pick this up. It bothered me, that word. For Rabbi Meir to command his Talmud to go and entice and tempt his wife. It is so bizarre. It doesn't fit with anything else. And the other thing, which was really interesting, I'm not sure whether I mentioned it to you, that we know that Rabbi Meir, I'll tell you certainly two primary sources. Rabbi Meir is somebody for whom Shalom Bayis is absolutely paramount. It is to the extent, the famous story, the Gemara, the Gemara Yerushalmi, and which is also brought in the Medrash, that Rabbi Meir found out about somebody. He used to give a shiur Friday night, and there was somebody who used to attend his shiur, and the wife got very annoyed about it, and she said that she was going to divorce him. He has to spit in Rabbi Meir's eye, and Rabbi Meir overheard it, and he pretended that he had something in his eye, and he asked the husband to go and spit in his eye. In other words, Rabbi Meir would be prepared to negate his own personal ego and honor for the sake of Shalom Bayis. That is how important Shalom Bayis is. And that same person, because of once his wife, who otherwise we know has an impeccable, sterling record at so many different levels, once expressed skepticism about a Mama Chazal, he would go and he would do such a thing. It's difficult to understand. Here's another Gemara in Gittin, Daf Nun Gimel, Daf Nun Beis. It says, Rabbi Meir once stayed in a city, Zman Rav, a long time, in order to make Shalom Bayis between one couple who had, Gemara in Sanhedrin, the Yalkut Shimoni. We have a number of sources that indicate that Shalom Bayis was very important to Rabbi Meir. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing. So here we have, and then you have the real problem is a halachic problem. It's a real halachic problem. Lifnei Iver. To go and tell the Talmud to do so, and to entice, and without telling his wife, is Lifnei Iver for the Talmud, Lifnei Iver for her. In a very important matter, it could even be a Bizrayu Da'aroyas, which could be Yehorig Val Yaver. It just doesn't make sense. So the Baal Tiferes Yisrael, Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, writes as follows. He says, Shehaya Yodeya Shehu Yorei Shamayim. He says Rabbi Meir knew the Talmud was Yorei Shamayim, V'lo Yaseh Imo Isur, and he wouldn't do an Isur even if she were to agree. V'chein Hava, he says. This is what the Baal Tiferes Yisrael says. Chas v'sholem Rabbi Meir would be mashel kein nira lefi ani is daiti. The problem is, first of all, there's two problems on that, asks Rav Henkin. First of all, ein apotropos l'arayis. We know that. And there's even a story in the Gemara in Kiddushin where Rabbi Meir himself almost was nichshal. Either be that as it may. So we know ein apotropos l'arayis. And secondly, surely in the execution of this, even if he doesn't do anything at the end, surely there would be improper thoughts and leisasuru and v'nishmar to be called over. It doesn't seem to make any sense. The Ben Ish Chai says as follows. The Ben Ish Chai Ben Yehoyada writes as follows. Oid Yosef Kushya Chazokal Rabbi Meir Balanes. This is a direct quote, right? Quote from the Ben Ish Chai. Eich nitten nosan reshus letalmid lasois lo pitoy zeh v'loi choshash penyale beliboy hirhurim ro'im be'es shemedaber imo b'divrei ritzu yu pitoy. How How could that be mutter? That the Talmud surely would have, at the very least, he would have improper thoughts. Well, the subject matter they're discussing is not appropriate and osa. And he says the Ben Ish Chai, and I think we are forced to say, with all due respect to the Ben Ish Chai, of course, that he was backed into a corner. He's clutching, he's grasping for a way to explain this. And he comes up with the following: V'nira li b'siyata d'ishmaya, da'osei talmid hoya soris. This Talmud was in English it's a eunuch. He was incapable of following through, right? He didn't have the koyach gavra. He was sexually impotent, unable to. Ve'ein lo shum taiva v'hirur. Now, I don't know anything, I know very little about eunuchs, but he's assuming, and I have no reason to doubt that because they don't have the capacity, it means they don't have any desire. Okay, maybe. She didn't know that that why? Because there is such a thing called the sris bidei shamayim she'eino nika mibachutz klal. In other words, he didn't have a very high-pitched voice and effeminate mannerisms or whatever, which would kind of give the game away, right? These were very popular, the castrati, in the courts, in medieval courts.
My sister wrote her thesis about it.
Oh, really?
Castrati, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Because Baroque music.
That's right. Baroque music was very much, the castrati were well known in medieval times. So that would have been pretty obvious, but that was done by men, done by people. Here she's saying there is another type of sris, which is a sris bidei shamayim, and nobody would have known. So this is how the Ben Ish Chai, but there's no indication in Rashi that there's any either for the Ben Ish. I mean, the Ben Ish Chai has to come up with a big chiddush too. It's a real big chiddush. It's what we would call a nukimta. He's backed into a corner. He says, I must say that it must even his answer to say that it was a sris, but that doesn't answer. What about his wife? She will be over. By the way, a woman is also newsflash. It applies to women as well. A woman is not allowed to be maharer for bedvar avera, avodah zarah or znus either. No difference. You look in the Sefer Chinuch; it's made for women as well. So it's to put it mildly, it's very difficult to understand this. Okay. And then she goes on and she commits suicide, which, by the way, is then dealt with by the poskim, the Shus Yankov and others, who talk about, they learn halachas of suicide, some of the halachas of suicide from this. It's difficult to see a woman who has the moral strength. That's why I wanted to mention that medrash this morning. Think about the resilience, the moral fortitude, the koyach that somebody has. Two beloved children die, and you're able to conceal it for the rest of Shabbos from your husband. And you know what? How stable and sane and rooted and grounded, what a strong person that must be. And then such a person, would give in to temptation and then commit suicide. Does that sound like somebody who is suicidal or capable of suicide? You have to be in a really, really, really bad place to commit suicide. It's complicated. It's really, really difficult. Okay. Now, Rav Henkin's suggestion is that we're going to see, he asks a bunch of questions also to demonstrate that what we have here in Rashi is either Rashi put it in, but it comes from a doubtful source, or more likely, it wasn't even Rashi that put it in. Now, I know that's a big statement, but he asks a number of very, very good questions. First of all, here's an interesting question. Tosfos, on that page in Avodah Zarah, I mean, when the first time many years ago where I saw this Rashi, wow, what a, I mean, it's obviously, for obvious reasons, it doesn't find its way into the kids' art scroll books and comics about Maisim of Gedolim and stuff for obvious reasons. And I didn't learn this until I was probably, I don't remember, late into my teens when I came across this. It's not a nice story. It's not a good story in that sense. But it is, one thing is for sure, it is surely a shocking story. It is one that is worthy of comment. Yes? Whichever way you look at it. Tosfos is utterly silent on the page. Tosfos makes no mention of it. And Tosfos is always, and Tosfos, there is even a Tosfos on the page that discusses suicide. But not this. On the same page. So that's already a massive question mark, first of all. None of the Bali, there is no other source. There is no other source. It just like comes out of the blue. A doyer before, in the time of the Goinim, we have the exact opposite, where alive and well, she accompanies him to Bovel. Tosfos says absolutely nothing. And the first and the only source we have is this Rashi. It just seems to be very strange. Seems to be very strange. And by the way, Rashi is also very quick to say on a number of places that this we don't find this anywhere. And he brings a bunch of sources to show when things don't appear to have another source, especially when they are something unusual. Rashi says this. He's also happy to say things are not correct when they don't appear to be correct. Rashi, a couple. Rashi in Menachos. Rashi says, Rashi in Avodah Zarah. V'kashya ki lo motzina b'chol ha-Talmud. V'koshe ze chosem in ha-Sefer. And a bunch of others. Okay? So he's really done his homework. Okay, we have the Maril. One of the Tosfos on that page talks about the permissibility of suicide and when it is and when it isn't permissible on that page, and makes no mention of this Rashi, which is with this shocking assertion of Rabbi Meir's wife committing suicide. This omission is so stark, it really does not seem to make much sense. And then we have, he says, then he does something really interesting, and this is where it's useful to be a scholar. Sometimes it is useful to be a scholar. He says the only ksav yad, the only manuscript we have of Rashi on Avodah Zarah is that from Parma, right? Which it's called ksav yad Parma, and it is dated roughly 1300. Okay, and if you look at that ksav, he's done a side-by-side comparison of the ksav yad that we have and the way our Rashi is printed. And there are a few small but important differences. Okay? For example, here's one. In the Ksav Yad, it says that the Talmud, Hiftzir bo yomim rabim ad shenisratzis loi, until she gave in to him. In our Rashi, it says ad shenisratzis. That word loi is missing. Now, that may sound like nothing, but it's actually a major, major difference. Why? Because if you're familiar with the expressions that are used, nisratzis loi means that she followed through, and she actually was intimate with him. That's what nisratzis loi would be translated and understood as. She actually went ahead and was intimate with him. Nisratzis loi. Nisratzis without the loi just means it depersonalizes it. Nisratzis, she acceded. It doesn't have this, you're not obligated to translate that she actually followed through. So in the original Ksav Yad, we have the story even more shocking in the Ksav Yad. But in Rashi that we have, it isn't there. That's one difference, and there are others. And in there it says, Kshenoida Hadova, in the Gersa of the Ksav Yad, it says, when the matter became known, she strangled herself. In the Rashi we have, it says, Ukshenoida Lo, when it became known to her, she strangled herself. What does that suggest to you? The first one says The first one says she went ahead and she was intimate with him. The Gsavyad of Parma would appear to indicate she went ahead and she was intimate with him, and then the story got out, so she committed suicide. This one says she gave in, Ukshanoida, and when she became aware of what? She became aware that this was all a ruse from her husband. She then strangled herself. So there are significant differences. Okay? And then he does something really, really interesting. I've decided I'm not going to go through the whole thing with you because it's going to take too long, and it's a bit of a sideshow. It's a bit of a sideshow to our general topic. I'll give you this. I'll give you a copy of this, and you can work it out. But he does show then there's a similar Gemara, and he shows how the error might have crept in, because there's a similar Gemara in where there's a Maisa mentioned. There's another place in Shas where it says sometimes a Maisa of this, a Maisa of that. This is the only place in Shas, by the way, where we have where the Gemara mentions a Maisa, a story of something, and doesn't say. And we only have one primary source as to what that was. It's the only place. There are also other textual inconsistencies, and he then has a fascinating, his conclusion, which is very credible, given all the questions, is that somehow that Rashi this is not actually originally from Rashi, which is definitely a possibility. You can look at it and judge for yourselves. But let's move on. We're almost out of time. What I want to do, the next thing that I want to do is show some examples of women who were learned throughout the ages and whose opinions were taken seriously. Okay, and there's a bunch of them. Now, one of the sources for this, again, I'm following a bit of my own interest here. You've heard of the Torah Tamima? Yes? Torah Tamima was Reb Baruch Epstein, who was a nephew of the Netziv. He was a bank clerk who was very learned, and he wrote the Torah Tamima. He also wrote a very, very interesting and controversial book called Makor Baruch. You can get online on Hebrew books. You can only get, interestingly, in Otzah HaChochma, I only found the first chelek. And he has a chapter, Perek Memvav, chapter 46, which is called Chochmas Noshim. And we're not going to go through all of it because it's not possible. And he quotes a whole list of women through the ages that were clearly learned and were quoted, but it's controversial. One of the things he discusses is conversations he would have with his auntie, the first wife of the Netziv, Reina Batya, her name was. And she seems to have been a very learned woman, and she would spend a lot of time learning, and in his words, knew very little about housework. And it seems, on the basis of his conversations, she was some sort of proto-feminist, and they would have running arguments about the women and women learning Torah, and the various proofs that she brought. And it's really fascinating. We'll go through a few bits and pieces of it, some of the primary sources, and then we'll have a look at some of the critiques of them, and then we'll move on to the next topic next week. But I think just before we go, that we'll do next week. Just before we go, I want to leave you with one or two questions, okay? Just want to leave you with one or two questions. In order to do that, we are going to look back at, where's it gone? There's a Rambam or two I wanted to do with you, which are difficult. Here. Turn to page 4. Turn to page 4 here. Okay? So the Rambam has paskened like Rabbi Eliezer, okay? That women are not to be taught Torah. Kobe, look at this. 17. Number 17. 17 and 18 are two Rambams, which we need to put together with the primary Rambam about teaching Torah. Yeah? Let's have a look. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah. He talks about paradise, he talks about Maisa Merkava and Maisa Bereshis. Now, this is a separate topic. The Rambam's opinion, which a lot of Rishonim didn't agree with, the Ran and others, is that Maisa Bereshis means physics, and Maisa Merkava means something slightly more esoteric. Doesn't matter, right? Because there's a Gemara in Chagig about how many people you're allowed to teach Maisa Merkava, teach Maisa Bereshis. But look at this. He quotes then source 17. I'm going to run through it. It'll take us 2 minutes. Paradise. Paradise, Pshat Remez Drush Side, right? Kamesha Amra Abba Nichnusu LeParadise. Va'afal Pi Shegdoilei Yisrael Hayu Chachamim Gdoilim Hayu Loi Kulam Hayu Bem Koyach Leida Lahasig Kol Advarim Al Buriyam. Va'ani Oimer, says the Rambam, and remember this is not in Meir Nevuchim, this is in Yad. Va'ani Oimer, She'einu Ra'oi L'Tayel B'Paradise, to stroll in this orchard. Only is Ela Mishan Ismalek Kreisai Lechem Ubasa. Your belly has to be full of bread and meat. What's bread and meat? You need to know Shulchan Aruch, Shas and Shulchan Aruch, basically. There's a Gemara in Sukkah and in at least one other place where the Gemara talks about Dova talks about Rabbi Ben Zakkai, Dova Cotton. He knew everything. He knew Dova Cotton and Dova Godel. Dova Cotton, says the Gemara, was Havayas Habaya Verova. That's called Dova Cotton. Yeah? Dova Godel is Masa Merkava. Says the Rambam, how can I say Va'afal Pisha Dvarim Elu, Dova Cotton Karoisim Chachomim? I'm telling you now that you need to know Lechem Ubasa, which is basically Shas and Poiskim, but Chazal call that Dova Cotton. The Havayas, the Abaya Verova, the Gemara itself calls Dova Cotton. Sheharei, Omru Chachamim, Dova Godel Maisa Merkava, Dova Cotton, Havayas, the Abaya Verova. Afal Pikein, answers the Rambam, Ru'uyin Hein Lakdimon, they come first. The Dova Cotton, which is to you and me, Shas and Poiskim, right? Abai Verova, you have got to know them first. Why? Listen to this. Shehin miyashvin dato shel adam tchila. They settle your mind. They give you the critical, analytical tools to be able to understand things properly. It's the heart of Torah. V'oid. Shehem hatoiva hagdoila. Shehishpia hakadosh baruch hu liyishuv ha'olam hazeh k'dei linchel chayei ha'olam haba. You want to get into Olam haba? You get there via the Havayas Abaya Verova. That's how you get there. Ve'efsher sheyedom hakoil. And the Havayas of Abaya Verova, anybody can know them. Cotton, ve'efsher sheyedom hakoil. Cotton v'godel, small or large or big. Ish ve'isha. Ba'alev rachav or ba'alev kotzor. A woman can also equally be totally conversant with all of the Havayas of Abaya Verova. And all of the Osav Hamuta. But I thought, Rambam, then we can't teach it to them. So he's saying very clearly, that's one Rambam. You could wriggle out of this one a little bit. You could say, yes, okay, so they can teach themselves, maybe. That's how they get access to, okay, maybe, but then let's look at the next one. Kala Isaac Batayra, and this is a Rambam in Hilchas Tshuva, right? So he definitely clearly learns that women are capable of learning Talmud. That's for sure. You see that in that source. Then at the end of Hilchas Tshuva, he says, "Kol ha'isek b'Torah k'dei lekabel schar k'dei shalei tagia k'dei shalei tagia lav puron is haris ha'isek shalei lishma." If you engage in Torah to get schar, that's shalei lishma. V'chol ha'isek b'loy liyira v'loy lekabel schar ela mipnei ahavas adoin kol ha'oretz shetziva ba haris ha'isek lishma. To learn Torah lishma is to do so for its sake, for the love of Hashem, to get close to Him. Remember, we saw this as the Sifri on V'ohav Tos Hashem L'kecha, right? V'amru chachamim lo'oy lo mi'asek adam b'Torah afilu shaloi lishma shemitech shaloi lishma ba lishma lefichach. Therefore, kashem melamdin es haktanim ves hanoshim uklal amei ha'oretz. Therefore, when you teach kids, women, or amei ha'oretz, ein melamdin eson elo la'avoid miyira k'dei lekabel schar. You start off and you teach them shaloi lishma, yira to get schar. Ad shetarbe da'aton v'yischakmu chochma yiseira. But then, once they get into it and they become wise, then megalim lohem roz ze ma'at ma'at. Then you start teaching them this secret a bit by bit. Umargilin oisam le'inin ze benachas, and then they get into the learning of Torah properly until they fully understand it and appreciate it. V'yedu v'yavduhu me'ahava. So clearly referencing that once you haven't started off by teaching them Torah out for reward. You tell them Shalei Lishma, and then slowly their das becomes greater, and then they have access to all of knowledge and all of Torah. Again, a little bit strange for a Rambam who said that we're not allowed to. He's talking about Megalin Lahem. He's not even talking about them learning it. He's talking about Megalin Lahem. Bit difficult to see how that is consistent with the other Rambam. Okay, we'll leave it here.